Look at this top. Here's the neckline and the armhole, and it's all finished clean inside with an all-in-one facing technique. That's the front there. That is the back facing. This is a super neat technique that you can do with woven projects and knit projects. The technique is actually the exact same thing. I'm sharing today 2 ways that you can do this. This is knit, this is woven. It's going to be super practical, and this is going to help you finish your projects really neat inside, which is what we always want. So stay tuned. Hi sewing friends, I'm Karina from liftingpinsandneedles.com. Welcome to this channel that is all about sewing, limitless sewing. I'm super excited to bring you these sewing techniques that I know are going to help you in your projects. I've recently been sewing a knit tank that has a lot of lovely details on the neckline. It's got an asymmetric neckline actually, and the way that this is finished inside is with an all-in-one facing. So it was the perfect chance for me to film the technique and share it with you in a standalone video. This is a technique that you'll find in different patterns, and it doesn't really matter what shape the neckline has, the technique will be the same. So don't get confused if you see a V neckline or a rounded neckline, an asymmetric neckline, maybe even a little sweetheart neckline. The shape that you see here on the front doesn't change the technique at all. The only thing that changes is the type of shape you're sewing here. But the way that this gets finished inside with the facing will be exactly the same. So in the example that I'm going to show you, I am sewing on a knit garment. So you might see a few differences, maybe in the way that we are stabilizing all these areas, but in the actual sewing it will be the same. So the main concepts is that this is a technique that you use with sleeveless garments, whether it's a bodice for a dress, whether it's just a tank top, whether it's just a dress that doesn't have a bodice seam, that doesn't really matter. What is common here is that you have some type of neckline, whatever shape it is, and you have sleeveless armholes. And these can be finished inside super neatly with this technique. So you'll basically be sewing shoulder seams as a first step, both on your main and on your facing pieces. For your main fabric, if you're working with a woven, you will most likely be stay stitching. I know I would. And then your facings would be fully interfaced. When I interface facings, I block fuse. And a lot of you asked me this question, and I might make a whole video about it just on its own. It's so simple. You just interface a piece of fabric that is slightly larger than the piece you're going to cut out. Once you've got that piece fused completely with interfacing, then you put your facing piece on top and then you cut it out. That is block fusing. It's no special science, nothing hard at all, and it just conserves the shape of the facing, this exact same size it's got to be. There's no room for error there. If you're working with slippery fabrics and you cut out your facing first, then you cut out your interfacing, and then you're trying to fuse them together at the ironing board, you might end up with a different shape. And worst, sometimes the interfacing, the glue and the heat interacts with the fabric, the fibers, and then you end up with a smaller facing. So all those things are prevented when you just interface a piece of fabric, get it over and done with, and then you place your facing on top and cut it out. So that is the way I would do it with a woven or a knit. It would be no different. When you have a front and a back that are both on the fold, you will have facings that are the same. So you won't have center seams on the facings, no way like that. You would just have 4 pieces basically, a main front, a main back, both on the fold, and then you have facing pieces, 1 front, 1 back. So when you see this scenario, whether it be woven, whether it be knit, it's going to be the same thing. You're going to sew the neckline first, and then you're going to sew one armhole separately and then the other armhole separately. Side seams come last. If you think you can get away with sewing the side seams before enclosing everything, you are going to end up seam ripping them. So just remember, do not touch those side seams until the very end. So we are going to be using this example that I've shown you here. This is a knit garment, it's ITY, super lightweight. I do have an interfaced facing right there. I use knit tricot interfacing fusible. It's really lightweight. I'm sure you can find it. I mean, if I can find it and I'm in Brazil, I'm sure you can find it wherever you are. It does need to stretch. You cannot use non-stretch interfacing for a knit project because your garment has to give. We're going to see how this came together. You're going to be able to do it for sure after you've seen this, and you'll be able to replicate this on any other style that has this type of finishing inside. All in one facing. Let's go. What I have here are 2 pairs of shoulder seams. These are the main pieces. I've got the back on the front, which is the interface side. This is the one that's not going to stretch, so I want this one on the top touching my presser foot, and this other side I want it down on the feed dogs to prevent that one from stretching. That's how I'm going to sew that. And then I have the shoulder seams of the facings. This doesn't matter which one's on top, they are both interfaced, so I'm just going to sew all these 4 seams. After sewing the shoulder seams of the facing, I have also finished the edges of the facing. Here at the bottom you can see they're curved. I've gone through the serger with that. Okay, here I have my main front and back shoulder seams. This is a neckline. I'm going to take my facing and place it on top, following the shape right there. So I'm going to match everything up, shoulder seams with shoulder seams all along, and pin it all together, and then we're going to sew it. Here's the front. This is the shape that we have there. This is where we're going to do the pivot when we're coming down from this curve. So now we sew this. This technique is the same if you're doing it on a rounded neckline that is more symmetrical. The technique is the same. The only thing that's different here is the shape, that it curves here, it has a corner, and then it goes straight up. I'm going to start somewhere on the back here. That is the dot where I pivot. This is the corner of the neckline where we're going to snip into diagonally up to that little dot right there. And now along the area of the neckline where it's curved, I'm going to do a few snips. So that area is pretty straight going up, but then when we get to the back neckline, it is curved. So we'll just snip to relieve the tension of that when the facing is flipped to the inside on this front curve also. In this area, I'm going to trim the seam allowance smaller so it's less bulky. What we're going to do is understitch now, so let's extend this. I'm going to have the facing on my right hand. This is the facing, you can see the interface side right here. And on my right hand I have the main fabric, and I'm going to push the seam allowance underneath the facing. And now I'm going to sew on the edge here, all around the neckline, being careful here on the corner where we pivoted, and the stitching is going to help the facing stay inside all around the neckline. So I'm going to slide the main pieces under here, under the presser foot, and I'm going to have the facings on this side, on the left. Remember, the seam allowance is pointing this way, it's underneath the facing here. And I'm going to start understitching somewhere at the back. Again, I've got my blind hem presser foot with a needle to the left to make this neater. Here are the shoulder seams. Here is the corner. I've just extended this as much as possible, and I'm going to sew right on the edge, being careful not to create a pleat there. Now we can flip the facing to the inside on the neckline here. So the neckline is finished. It's really neat. There's the facing inside. Before we finish the armholes, I'm going to go and give this neckline a nice press, because it's going to be easier to do now than after everything's done. I've been to the iron and I've pressed my neckline really nicely. We are looking at this with the facing up and the main piece down there. You can see one of the armholes extended. The side seams are still loose. We are going to sew each armhole separately. So we're going to take this one that's at the bottom of the screen. We're just going to separate the facing from the main here. And then all the rest of the garment that's under here is going to be inside. We're going to just make a little row here. And that's how we end up with the armhole right sides together now, with everything inside. So what we do now is match this armhole, which in this case turns out to be the back. There's double notches there, shoulder seams and the single notch. So you have those marks on the facing, and you have them at the back on the main piece also. So we just need to match this up and sew this curve. So I'll just repeat what I've done in case you missed it. We have our garment like this extended on the table. The facing is on the top, top, the main piece is on the bottom. The main has the wrong sides up. We take this armhole from the facing and separate it from the armhole that's down there. We shuffle this along, put all the garment underneath, and then put your hand underneath, grab your shoulder, bring it over, match this other shoulder seam from the facing, and we're going to have the garment tucked in there, and we're going to have a roll. It's a type of burrito roll method, going to enclose the armhole, and we match it up and we sew it. Okay, here we have the armholes pinned together, facing with the main, right sides together. Throughout this whole process, just be careful, hold your fabric in your hand, don't push it, don't stretch it. This is a knit fabric. Even though it is stabilized with interfacing, it still has the potential to stretch if you are too rough with it. After the seam is sewn, we're going to do a few snips also because this armhole is curved, getting close to the seam line but not through it, of course. Okay, here we have the armhole. Now we can turn it right sides out. Just take the garment that's inside here and just gently pull it through. And now we have one armhole that's enclosed. We have the neckline that's enclosed. Before we finish the second armhole that is still open, we need to understitch this armhole that we've just done. So we're going to turn it this way so we see the wrong side of the garment, and this is what we need to understitch. We take our facing with our left hand, push the seam allowance underneath it, and sew on the edge. I'm going to leave a section on the side here without the understitching, about 5/8, so it doesn't interfere with sewing the sides later. And you might not have all the access to go all the way through, so we're going to have to do it in 2 stages, from here to there, from there to there. Okay, so here's the main garment, here's the facing. It's tiny, and I'm not starting from the edge as I said. I'm going to leave a little bit free there. Again, I've got my blind hem presser foot that helps me sew neatly. That's as far as I can get. The shoulder seam is about 1.5 inches away. There's no way I can get through it without stitching other types of fabric underneath. So now I flip my garment to the other side. Now I'm going to have the facing on this side, on the right side, and the main garment on the left. I have to use my regular presser foot for this one just because of the direction that I'm sewing. Again, I'm going to start a little further from the edge. Seam allowance is under the facing. It's just that now it's this way. From this side, I was able to go past the shoulder seam, and I'm going to be able to reach where I started before. So I ended up with the whole armhole being understitched, which is not always possible. It just depends on how wide your shoulder seam is. So this shoulder seam is not too narrow. That's why I was able to understitch the whole armhole. In others that are narrower, sometimes you can just get up to here and you have a distance around the shoulder seam that can't be understitched because you don't have access. But this was okay. Do have the armhole on the top of the screen open. So now we do the exact same thing. Take the facing, bring it over here, glue everything underneath, and then take this shoulder seam. With this shoulder seam, just wrap it around like this, and now we can do our second armhole, which is the same thing. Just match everything up, match your notches, match your shoulder seams, and it's the same type of seam. Okay, I've pinned what I've shown you right there. The garment is tucked in underneath. Remember, you can't sew the second armhole until you have completely finished the first one. That means sewing it, flipping it, and understitching it. If you skip the understitching, go ahead and do that first, and then do this that I'm showing you now. Now with the second armhole, it's the exact same process. We just snip right here into the curves, all the same, just repeating one after the other. For this process, you do need to leave the side seams for the end. You cannot sew these at an earlier stage at all. If you did by mistake, you're going to end up seam ripping them because there's no way you can enclose these seams and have the side seams already sewn. It has to be done right at the end. So now we can flip this. Just take out the garment through here. This is ITY, so it's really slippery. It's really easy to flip the other way. So here we have a finished neckline, one finished armhole that has been understitched. And now The only thing left is to understitch this armhole to have finished this process here of enclosing necklines and armholes. So I'll do the exact same thing I did on the other one. I'm not going to film that again because it's the exact same thing. Always a seam allowance tucked under the facing, which is this piece right here, and we don't start right at the edge, we leave a little bit undone. Okay, here we have our garment with the neckline and the armholes all done, all enclosed. Now all we need to do are the side seams, and it's so easy because the side seam and the facing is done in one go. So you can see the little short facing pieces right here. We are just going to extend these like that, including the side seam, and sew them together. It's super easy. You do that on both sides. Okay, here I have both side seams pinned, including the facing. It's all continuous. The technique you've seen here on a woven would be exactly the same, only the difference there is that I wouldn't just sew it on the serger, I would sew it on the sewing machine, and I would prefer to have the side seams open, which means I would have serged the edges separately first. Here you can see the side seam extended on the ironing board, and I'm just pressing the seam allowance to the back here, including this little facing bit there. Now we can fold the facing inside, press it again right there, and you can see how neat and clean this is on the inside. That's why I didn't want the understitching to go all the way through, so that this seam of the facing could be nice and clean without the understitching in the way. If you did understitching there all the way, this would get really bulky. Here is the other side seam. I'm going to do the exact same thing, just press the seam towards the back, then fold this in, and that's it. Super easy. It's a really neat finish. See the neckline up closer, how the neckline is asymmetric. I really like that shape there, and it's really fun to put together, finished really cleanly with an all-in-one facing inside. So the neckline and the armhole seams are all enclosed with facing. Really nice. I didn't want to show you too many details about the pattern because it hasn't released yet, but it will be very soon, so just keep your eyes open this week for that tank pattern that is finished with that facing. I didn't want to show you much details about what's going on here, but there are super nice design features and fitting features in that one, and I'm really excited to share when the time comes. This was just a sneak peek. You can see that it's got a super beautiful asymmetric neckline, and it totally makes sense that this particular knit garment has this finish inside, because it is actually the best way to finish an asymmetric neckline. If you think about it, how are you going to do a mitered corner here for a neckband? You know, it could end up being more complex than this method actually is. So I think this finish for this type of design is perfect. But remember, don't get confused or hung up on the shape of this neckline that you saw me pivot there. That doesn't matter. If you are sewing a style with a rounded neckline, it's going to be even easier. You just do your rounded seam. If it has a V neckline, then your pivot is going to be in the center. This one was offset to the side. Don't worry about those things. Just know that you sew your neckline first, you flip it right sides out, stay stitch that, and then you go do one armhole and then the other armhole. Now you notice that this shoulder area is quite wide, which allowed us to understitch the whole armhole. In other styles that have a narrower shoulder right here, the access with the sewing machine is really difficult, and sometimes you can't get all the way through. So there is a section that doesn't get understitched. With this one, it was particularly easy to do. So up to now, the method we saw had both the front and the back pieces cut on the fold, and same as the facings, which has you do the burrito rolls here on armholes. Well, there is another technique that ends up being a little easier, and it'll work if your garment has a center back seam. Your garment might have a center back seam because there's shaping incorporated there. In that case, finishing this all-in-one facing is going to be even easier. You will have a center back seam on your facing also. And look, this can work to line a dress or a top. This is why in the following technique that I'm going to show you, I'll be using the words facing or lining sort of interchangeably. If I had a basic tank, had a facing like this, and I wanted to line the whole thing because I'm working with a sheer fabric, I could just lengthen it and it will have the same length as the top. You know, you could do that. That's why I'm saying it's either a facing or a lining, because the technique is going to be exactly the same thing. You know, however long the side seam is here, it's not going to affect anything. You're either going to have a tiny side seam here for the facing, or just a longer one for a lining, and you could line a whole top or you could line a whole dress. So that doesn't really change. When you see these things and when I tell you, you know, it's just longer, I hope you really get the point that it's the exact same thing. Don't think it's harder or a whole different technique if you're lining a whole top or a whole dress, or if you're just doing a facing, because everything that happens up here is going to be exactly the same. So let's see. This is the front. These are the two back pieces. There are shoulder seams that have been sewn, and the back has a center back seam. That's why you can see that opening there. Everything has been serged, all the edges for both the main fabric and the lining. I'm using the same fabric to line, so it'll be self-lined. You can see my shoulder seams there have been pressed open and serged separately. This is the armhole right there, and everything has been stay stitched within the seam allowance. The pattern uses 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I've stay stitched at about 3/8 of an inch. The prep work I've done basically is serge, sew the shoulder seam and stay stitch everything, the neckline, the armholes, that's all ready. And I've got this fabric right sides up. Now I'm going to place the lining layer on top, which is exactly the same, and I'll have them be right sides together. Okay, so I've placed the lining layer on top of the main. They are exactly the same, they are right sides together. Here you can see the shoulder seams, the neckline matching, the armholes matching. As you can see, the lining layer has a strip of interfacing fused along the neckline. You can see the black right along the edge there of the V neckline and the back there. You can also see the strip of interfacing fused along the edge of the armholes. Basically, the lining layer will have the interfacing strips to stabilize, and the main fabric will be stay stitched. Basically, what needs to happen now is sew these together on the neckline from the edge right there down to the V, up. Remember, these are separate, they're not together. The back center seams are open. Here is a closer look at the interfaced edges of the lining fabric, and the main fabric is just stay stitched. They just go right together there, and we start from one end of the neckline, sew, pivot there at the V, and go up the other side, and then sew along the armholes together, 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here I'm sewing along the armholes, just a really easy sew, keeping the seam allowance nice and neat. I have a horizontal pin at the shoulder seam to make sure that they're going to match. I try to not sew over it, just remove it as the needle is going right over it. And I'll repeat that on the other armhole. And now we go to the neckline. I've marked a dot there exactly where I need to pivot, so it's nice and neat. It's just a yellow dot. And now I'm sewing along the neckline. Here I'm going to reach the pivot point just carefully and then keep going up. Very simple step. I've just trimmed the seam allowance shorter in general, both layers. And now the lining side has the interfacing bit. We can trim it a little bit shorter than the main. I won't be going that overboard either, but just make it a little bit shorter, and then when they're together they end up being less bulky overall. After grading, lots of snipping, snip snip snip. The neckline has also been graded, you can see there, and now I'm just going to snip into that dot, but not through the stitching, just as close as reasonable right there. And I'll do a few snips here, although this is not very curved. I will still snip a little bit, and definitely at the back, and then I can flip these all right sides out. The coolest part about these lining techniques is turning things right sides out. So just put your hand in and just pull everything through. So we do have a little bit of a hot mess right there, but the armholes are nice and closed. The V is nice and sharp. Now what we have to do is understitch. You'll know what your lining layer is if you're using the same fabric because it's shorter. So I'm just gonna go and understitch all of these to the inside so that the lining layer stays inside, and I'll do that for the armholes and the neckline. I have one of the armholes here. This is the lining layer, this is the main, and I've got the seam allowance this way towards the lining, and I'll just sew on the edge to understitch. Here's the shoulder seam, and I can definitely go over it to a certain point. It's because these shoulder seams are too narrow, so I can actually sew the entirety of the armholes here with understitching. But that's as far as I can go, it's just too bulky here, so I'm just going to stop there and sew the rest from the other side. That's as far as I could go past the shoulder seams. I'll just pick up here on the other side, and now I've got the lining on this side actually, and the seam allowance going that way because I had to flip it. That's how that looks. So when I press it, all the lining layer is going to be inside, and you're going to see a nice clean edge on the outside of the garment. Same on the other armhole and for the neckline. This is the back. It's all separated, it's not together. All you need to do is unite it here at the neckline and just open it up, and you'll see both of these seam allowances, the wrong side, the back seams or right sides together, and it will just be one full stitch that will sew the main and then go over to the lining in one go. The lining is the shorter one. And that's sewn at the 1/2 inch seam allowance, the seam pressed open. And then we can go ahead and do the same exact thing for both side seams. Now that the back seams are sewn, you can see that was just one continuous stitch. We still have the side seams. This is when you take these, unite the bottom here of these 2 armholes, and then you have the shorter ones here for the lining in one continuous stitch with the main ones. And I'll do the same with the other side, and then you just flip it and everything's lined and clean. Here are the side seams pinned. This is the main layer. There is the underarm seam, and here comes the shorter lining bit. It will all be sewn as one. See, the V neckline is not too low. I think it's perfect and it's very clean. Same lining fabric inside, self-lined. The armholes too give really good cover, and there's no visible top stitching anywhere. Everything is just understitched inside to keep it nice and neat. I think this method is way easier. You don't need to burrito roll anything. You're gonna see it's way easier. So if you find this method easier, why don't you just add a center back seam to your tops that are cut on the fold on the back and do it this way? I think it could totally be possible. Sometimes I end up adding a center back seam to a garment that doesn't have one because I want to save fabric, and it's just going to help me cut out my pattern pieces with the fabric that I have in a better way. In that case, I would totally change my technique and do the all-in-one lining or facing in this way that I've just shown you. I find that it's so much easier, even if it means having a center back seam. Center back seams are not your enemy. You know, if you need to do sway back adjustments, they are much easier to do if you have a seam there already. They also help you save fabric. And for this specific technique, if you want to line a garment, if you want to line a tank top or do the facing in this way, it's going to be so much easier. I'll be seeing you quite a lot for the next few days. As usual, I've been really busy. What you're going to see from me for the next couple of days is super fun wearable knit projects. Some that are maybe beginner to intermediate and some that are super beginner friendly. There's a knit project for everyone in this week, so I will be seeing you pretty much daily and I'm excited. We'll be back to wovens in a little while, but not this week. See you again very soon. Bye.